Hi, Niki. Thank you so much for joining me on the You're Not Alone podcast today. I'm super excited to have you on. You are coming all the way from Rome to give me a
Exactly.
little bit of your time. Yes, to share a little bit of your expertise and knowledge in the mental health space. So, as we jump into this episode, can you take a second and introduce yourself to my audience?
Yes, Zach, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I was very glad to find your email on my mailbox because it's always very exciting and beautiful to talk about mental health and just try to find our path in navigating this difficult brain. Sometimes it is. So I am Niki Petrocchi, and somebody calls me Nico Petrocchi, so it's perfectly fine. And I live in Rome, and I've been living here for a while. Even if I was in United States for my PhD, so I've been there for
Mm.
1 year and a half. And I am a clinical psychologist here, and I teach also at John Cabot University, which is an American university, actually here in the center of Rome. And also, I'm the founder and president of a association that is basically devoted to promote compassion in psychotherapy, and it's called
Mm.
Compassion Focused Therapy. And
Yes.
so probably we will talk a little bit about that.
Yes, we will. That is absolutely one of the main talking points that I have. I'm curious,
Yes.
what is the state of mental health in Rome and Italy? Is it a conversation that people, because I know, like, I have some friends that are Italian. I have some friends that are Spanish. I studied abroad when I was in college, so I made some friends that way. One of my wife's best friends, yeah, she's dating an Italian. They live in Milan. Um, I'm interested to hear because I know that it's like Italians and Spaniards are rich in culture and history and
Mhm.
tradition. Is mental health something that's becoming more talked about in Italian society? Are people more open to those conversations? I'm curious to get your perspective on that.
Well, that's interesting. Surely it's not like in United States. Just to give you like a very basic fact, our insurances here, Italy-based insurance, they don't really cover psychotherapy. So that's
Wow.
really funny because not even my professional insurance cover my own psychotherapy, which is a little weird because like at least my insurance should cover. So this basically says something about Italians and Italy, that mental health is becoming more and more, I would say, popular, in a sense that people are more interested in staying healthy, and they're more interested in concept of stress and concept of cultivating mental health. At the same time, it's still a little bit not so well promoted, I would say. So, for example, when you go to general doctors, it's not very often they have, for example, a list of psychotherapists they
Mm.
can refer you to. So pros and cons, because Italians are warm, as they say. So there is
Yes.
a little bit of like more social vibe and social connections, and sometimes probably we talk a little bit more. People talk among themselves, and they actually share more frequently their problems. At the same time, there's still a little bit of shame
Mm.
about like if I talk with some of my clients, they would say, "Oh, my friends don't know that I'm going to a psychotherapist," even if things are changing. And I have to say, thank to all the, I would say, Netflix series and all the movies we watch, and people go to psychotherapy. That's a cool thing to do, and people
Mm.
realize that is an important thing to do. So in a way, we are cross fertilizing each other in a sense.
Yes, absolutely. And one thing that came to mind with the insurance side of things, because Italian, the way that it works, right, in Italy is it's healthcare is essentially free, right? The way I understand it is people pay in to the government. There's a certain tax that covers healthcare, and then everybody has access to that healthcare. But it's interesting to me that there isn't something that I guess some of those funds aren't allocated towards psychotherapy specifically at the moment. Are there private insurance companies in Italy, and do they cover psychotherapy?
No, actually, this is the thing. It's exactly the private insurance that don't cover psychotherapy. So we have a
Ah,
public service, and you can go to a psychotherapist there.
okay.
So technically, the government covers psychotherapy. Even if I have to say that, even if my colleagues that work in the public
Mm-hmm.
service and in the government services, they're amazing. Like we really have
Mm,
amazingly skilled professionals working there, but it's a little bit hard to access because
mm,
there is a long waiting list, and it's not really straightforward, and it's not so easy, and sometimes you don't have a lot of sessions allocated to your case. So if you want to do a full psychotherapy, you either have to pay out of your pocket, or you have to no, nothing. Pay out of your pocket, because technically the private insurance doesn't usually pay psychotherapy. So
okay.
it's a little bit weird. But I have to say that I really hope that more and more there will be more private insurances that cover psychotherapy. So maybe it's a hope for the future, because sometimes you don't really want to go to a government service because maybe there's something that you don't want to go to.
Yeah, because and it's interesting, and that's why I'm so excited to be able to ask somebody who lives in Italy and treats people in Italy, because that's been a big debate in the United States for years now, which is everything. I mean, not everything, but a large portion of our healthcare is it's all private. It's all private
Yeah.
insurance, and you can get smacked with a really big bill if you don't have insurance when you go to a healthcare provider. You studied in the United States. um, do you see are there pros and cons to both based on your experience? Do you have a perspective on that?
Yeah, well, there are. I have a perspective also based on the fact that I teach clinical psychology at the university. So there is actually a part of the program based on the pros and cons of having
Mm,
insurances paying for your for your bills. Um, for sure, I have to say that I guess in the United States it's more. Accepted. So, given that if you want to see a psychotherapist, it's in a way, if you have a private insurance, it's easier. And they, on the other side, what I hear is that sometimes they allocate you to
mm,
clinicians, and maybe that you don't really vibe with them, and so it's a little bit trickier sometimes.
yeah.
And also a little bit of a problem could be regarding the fact that as a clinician, if you are paid by an insurance company, of course you have limitations. So, for example, you can have limitations to the numbers of sessions you have, and you probably feel a little bit pressured. So, for example, let's. I'm gonna give you this example. Since I work for American with American students, sometimes I accept American insurances,
Mm,
and
mm,
uh, and that changes a little bit the type of work I do with them, because I know, for example, that I don't have. Um, I, I have to plan in advance how many sessions I have to provide them, and also I have to write extensive reports. Sometimes I have
mm,
to produce a diagnosis, and for example, for the way I work, I don't usually see people based on what type of diagnosis they have, but more on like symptoms and it's so at the end of the day, when I work with an insurance, I have to work with a DSM-5 text revision in mind, and
mm.
and so I have to box things in a different manner.
And it's so interesting that you bring that up, because that is something that I think is being talked a little bit more about here in the U.S. at least, in the field of psychology, which is that the DSM manual is fine, and it helps, I guess, us categorize people based on what they're struggling with, but it can often be a little rigid in how you approach treatment, how you approach care for somebody who might be struggling, and not having to put somebody in a box around their diagnosis. So that's really interesting that you bring that up. I'm curious, because you wrote this and in the form that you filled out prior to the interview, that through compassion focused therapy, CFT, which is something that you're a founder of, right? That's something that you're
I'm not a founder of CFT. So founder of CFT is Professor Paul Gilbert, who is in England. I was lucky enough to meet him 11 years ago, and I founded the
okay.
Italian branch.
Oh, nice.
And
Okay, so you brought it to Italy.
I brought it to Italy, but I was lucky enough to be a good friend and also a colleague. And he actually is my mentor, and is someone I've been learning from for like over the last really 12 years. So yeah, it's a
Okay.
beautiful approach.
Yes. So tell me more about that. What does compassion focused therapy treat, and how can compassion, mindfulness, and kindness heal the brain? I'm so curious to learn more about that.
Yeah, actually, I would like to say something about something very interesting you just said about the DSM-5 text revision, etc. So
Yeah.
I have to say that everything that you do in psychotherapy is very much determined by the type of goal you have in mind, the type of intention you have in mind. And
Mm,
intention is actually the driving force that determines whether an intervention is helpful or not.
mm,
Even the DSM, like there are amazing ways to use the DSM and the DSM and actually the criteria, because sometimes you have questions that the DSM helps you pose to the clients, and sometimes really having some type of diagnosis. If you really want to use them with the intention to help the client, the
mm,
DSM can become an amazing tool because it can open up areas that you wouldn't explore normally, because we are
mm.
clinicians, but we are, of course, we are humans, sometimes very complicated humans ourselves. So in a way,
Yes.
having like categories gives you the chance to organize the way you talk with the clients, explore areas that you wouldn't normally explore. So in my opinion,
Mm,
it's not the DSM the problem itself. It's sometimes when the clinician is a little bit superficial, that is actually the problem.
mm,
So the problem is
mm.
never in the tool. The problem is sometimes in how you use it. And I don't know what you think about that, but I think we shouldn't really end up with like the exam is terrible or is amazing. It's sometimes how you use a knife or how you use
Yes.
things.
I like that. No, I like that analogy that you just shared there at the end, and I think that that is a great point. That there's a lot of room for nuance, and it's not something as good or bad. It's all depends on how you use the tool. When you say a clinician being a bit superficial, I'm curious. What do you mean by that?
Well, meaning that, for example, even just giving the feedback to the client regarding
Mm,
what type of diagnosis the client has is really based on the type of connection we have with the clients. Because technically, even knowing is, I have some many clients asking me, so what's my diagnosis? And you really need to have the client in mind. You need to be, I guess, able to mentalize what could be the impact of being
mm,
diagnosed. So for some clients, being diagnosed with, I don't know, OCD or borderline personality
yeah.
disorder can be really the beginning of healing, because for some people it can be like, oh, finally have someone who tells me who I'd be struggling with. There is a name, and I can start the process of taking care of myself. People have been invalidating me all of my life. So it's some other times, if you don't understand the client, or if you risk to just name a diagnosis, and the client maybe is not ready. The client
Mm,
goes and Google the whatever you told them, and it can start a weird process where there is a disconnection there. So I believe that when I say superficially, means that maybe you are too quick, and you don't
mm,
really have your client in mind to the point that you're able to anticipate what a diagnosis could generate. And of course, the client asks. You always have to, in a way, disclose, but you need to be sensitive and you need to have compassion. And in fact, compassion, when in the approach of compassion focused therapy, means not just being kind with the client, which is, of course, part of our job,
mm,
but always it's compassion for us is about being sensitive to the suffering in ourselves and others with the intention to prevent and alleviate that suffering. And so when you use
Mm.
compassion as a driving force, like as a motivation that guides your practice and guides your intervention, part of compassion, of course, it needs to be wisdom, because you need to be able to take time and the courage and have the capacity to anticipate what is happening in the mind of the other, so that every intervention you do is basically guided by this intention to really help the client and
Mm.
doing to do things that are in line with how the client actually is and what can really heal the client, instead of like just following some mechanical procedure. So this is actually how compassion focused therapy began.
So, and I love how you just brought it full circle like that. So that was awesome. And it's so interesting that you bring that up, and I'm glad that you clarified sort of what you meant about superficial, because I've been diagnosed with OCD. I've lived with OCD diagnosis since 2016. And I remember leading up to that initial appointment. First off, it took me many different therapists to find somebody who actually knew how to treat OCD. Um, so I ended up going to a lot of different therapists that it you talk about that mechanical feeling, and it just felt a little mechanical. It felt like, okay, this is what the textbook tells me to do, so this is how I'm going to go about treating him. When I left the psychologist's office with a formal OCD diagnosis, it was almost exactly what you described, in terms of it was the start of my healing process. But at that time, I didn't fully recognize that. It felt more like a punch in the gut. And it felt more like my whole world has just been turned upside down. I've just been told that I have some sort of chronic brain disorder, that there is, like, literally I was told there is no pill, there is no cure, there is no surgery, that this is highly treatable, and that a lot of people reclaim their lives, but that there's work involved. And for me, like, that was my first introduction into really the world of mental health, but especially OCD. Um, and while I do feel that my clinician is a big reason why I'm where I'm at today, I do see that mechanical nature of approaching treatment really isn't helpful for the individual, because living with I never and people that listen to my podcast know this. I'm not a victim. I do not look at myself as lesser than or somebody that deserves special treatment because I live with something chronic. I want to be treated like everybody else. But compassion is such a fundamental aspect, I think, of recovery through chronic illness, because there is a lot of pain and suffering involved that sometimes I do think people forget about, because um, you can't see it. You can't see what's going on inside of the brain of somebody who's suffering with OCD or bipolar or schizophrenia or depression or anxiety. So I think that was a really, really, really great point that you brought up around not just having a mechanical approach, but putting
Yeah.
yourself in the shoes of the person who's struggling. And I was actually reminded of that last week from a direct message that I received from a friend um, who's in this space as well. So I really appreciate you saying that. So when it comes to compassion focused therapy, is this a therapy that runs alongside more traditional talk therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy, exposure and response therapy, ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy? Like, so is it complementary to some of the other talk therapies that are used?
Well, that's a big question because
Yeah.
it actually it's basically very linked to the very concept you were mentioning, that I think the beginning of healing happens when you contemplate how tricky the brain is. You know,
Mm,
compassion focused therapy really begins with the evolutionary based understanding of the fact that we haven't chosen this brain, we
mm,
haven't chosen our gender, we haven't chosen a lot of crucial things in life. And one of the things
yes.
we haven't chosen is how the brain is built and how it works. And it's very weird because sometimes we've been told that we have a fantastic brain, perfect
Hmm.
brain, which leaves us with the assumptions that if we struggle, we are using the brain in the wrong way. Because, I mean, if this
Mm,
brain is this amazing thing, why I'm struggling? Compassion focused therapy is a evolutionary based approach that actually wants to inform all the other approaches
mm,
based on the fact that we haven't chosen our brain. The brain is very tricky. It means that it's very easy for the brain to be dysregulated because
mm,
it's the outcome of millions and billions of years. And so
yeah.
we haven't really chosen what is there. And sometimes we haven't chosen to feel what guilt is. We haven't chosen to feel guilt. We haven't chosen our emotions. So sometimes people feel that the healing in compassion focused therapy really starts when they realize that I really haven't chosen my emotions. I really haven't chosen my past and the
Mm,
things that have dysregulated my emotions. So everything starts with a little bit of like, that's true. I mean, it's sad, but in a way, I hadn't chosen my life and my brain. And actually, compassion focused therapy, it doesn't really want to be just another school of psychotherapy. It
mm,
just wants to inform from a very strong scientific point of view, especially the evolutionary approach to psychotherapy. It just wants to inform other approaches of the fact that if we look at the brain from the evolutionary perspective, this perspective really helps everyone to feel less shamed about
mm,
what we feel. Because
yeah.
if nobody really tells you that you haven't chosen your brain and that's what's your brain is going through is not really your fault, if nobody tells you that, you can go to a therapy, but you can still feel a deep sense of shame and self criticism. And this is exactly what compassion focused therapy wants to help you with, because what we believe is that, and what we have data for, is actually that if you don't heal people with this basic process of shame and self
Mm,
criticism, and if you don't really help people understand that everything starts with a little bit of compassion for ourselves and for others, and then you can do all the techniques you want, but if you don't start with this basic, this shaming understanding of your brain, then a lot of other approaches can really be not so strong. And you can go to a therapist, and this therapist can do a lot of amazing things, but deeply inside you have a sense of shame, you have a sense of
mm,
self-criticism that really you don't know how to deal with. So we believe, and we really don't want to say that we should only use compassion as a technique, but we really want to say that every technique you use, CBT, DBT, ACT, can be used um, with a with the help of a de-shaming, compassion-focused approach. Meaning that, for example,
mm,
when you use ACT, for example, I have a lot of colleagues that will use acceptance and commitment therapy, and I noticed that yes, you can accept your intrusion, you can learn how to embrace, to accept your intrusions, but if you also learn and experience your brain as like, this is not my fault, I haven't chosen this, and I haven't chosen the first experiences that I had in my life, even the acceptance procedures, they become smoother. And
yeah.
basically, and this is in fact something that I wrote in a paper that I published a couple of years ago on compassion for OCD. I don't know if you noticed
I
that. uh,
Oh
and
yeah,
that is
I
actually
have.
what
Yep. Yep.
that is what I feel helped those amazing clients that came to us to be treated with compassion. And yeah.
What you're saying really resonates with me because there is the call it the technical call it exposure and response prevention, which is really focused on, hey, let's get you habituated to the intrusive thoughts that you're experiencing, and it serves a very valuable function. But there is, and it's been this literally since 2016 for me, and I'm sure that there are so many people in the OCD community that resonate with what you're saying. Since those initial days when I was just learning what was going on with my brain, it's still an ongoing journey. So, and I always say this on the podcast, I haven't figured it all out. I am very much so on my journey, learning every single day. But it's so interesting what you say about the fact that it's like this separate part of the healing process where there is this compassion and acceptance that, oh, I'm allowed to feel all sorts of different emotions. I'm allowed to feel all sorts of or have all sorts of different thoughts and feelings, and that I inherited this brain, that there were things that have taken place in my life, things that I haven't chosen to go through. There are some things that I took an action and something happened. But the consequence of it is something that obviously I didn't know was going to happen, or I didn't choose. And there can be so much guilt and shame. And that
Yes.
guilt and shame stunts the healing process. In your work, how have you seen, or how do you start to implement self compassion? How do you get your clients to start to have more self compassion and start to make that mental switch? I'm curious, for me just as much as everybody who's going to listen to this episode. Like, I think that there's so much more self compassion that I could cultivate. So I'm curious, what does that process look like?
Well, everything really begins with what we started with is like telling our clients this idea of the brain, of this unchosen tricky brain.
Mm,
And it's funny, it seems like, oh, why should we start from so far away? Actually, yes, because if you really embrace the idea that, I mean, I haven't chosen to have two hands, or to have this skin color or whatever. So if you really start contemplating the fact that you haven't chosen your emotions,
mm,
you can really start feeling that, oh, maybe it's not my guilt, it's not my fault if I am experiencing this stuff. However, we always say in compassion focused therapy that once you realize that it was not your fault, it's not your fault. However, it's can be painful also to realize that it's your kind of responsibility to do something. I
mm,
say painful because sometimes we, of course, feel like, what? I mean, it's not my fault. So why should I take care of that if it's not my fault? But we do that many, many times in our life where basically things are not our fault, but sometimes we have to fix them. Otherwise, for example, there is this beautiful example that Paul always does, and it kind of resonated with me and my own issues. Like if you park your car at night in a perfect parking slot, and the day after you find that somebody has hit your car and your car is broken. I mean,
mm.
was it your fault for what happened? No, basically you had a perfect parking slot. You've chosen the perfect spot. But who is going to take the car
And
to
fix it.
the repair to fix it? I mean, me, because if I really want to use the car, it's true, it was not my fault, but it's my responsibility. It's me having to do that. So in a way, we already do this kind of things in our life, and a little
Mm,
bit also with our brain. Like it's not my fault if I have these dysregulated, weird emotions that I also have, but sometimes I can stop and I can say, okay, this is not my fault. I don't have to feel ashamed for what I experience, but I can do something, and that's when we teach our clients some what we call compassion focused skills. So in what we
mm.
call compassion focused training, that is basically a, a flow of practices that actually are very, very ancient. They've been inspired by an old Buddhist tradition. That basically they start with the breathing, a specific breathing pattern, because you can actually start regulating your mind through your breath, and then helping clients realize that sometimes when you kindle your compassion, both for yourself and others, your brain becomes calmer, because
Mm.
basically compassion is very much linked to the caregiving system in the brain. And the caregiving system is it's triggered, it's actually linked to oxytocin and autonomic nervous system in the body is called the parasympathetic nervous system, that actually has a calming effect on you. So we learn, clients learn, and we learn with them gradually that yes, it's not their fault if they have these dysregulated emotions, but we can start feeling compassion for maybe those emotions and for the pain that generated those emotions and maybe for the
Mm.
others, and in a way that your brain becomes more regulated. In fact, we don't believe really that only one type of compassion is useful. So we don't really believe only in self-compassion, but really believe in the fact that we want to experience the three flows of compassion, we call it. So I want to learn how to be compassionate with myself, but also want to learn how to notice the suffering in others and to be compassionate towards others, but
Mm.
also to be open to the compassion from others. So in a flow that doesn't leave anyone uh,
Left out.
alone, left
Yeah.
out. And this flow is important because sometimes when you do too much self-compassion, you really miss the calming, healing effect of focusing on somebody else.
Mm.
And we know from a lot of research that when you open up really and you become sensitive to the suffering of others, maybe others that have OCD, and and when you are like when you have the intention of sending them and send them wishes that may you be happy, may you be free one day from the suffering, the
Mm.
brain heals, and the brain goes into these states that are actually regulating, and you have more positive emotions, and your parasympathetic system is working better. So a lot of things happen when you actually train the three flows of compassion.
And what are the three flows? It's self-compassion, compassion for
So
others.
yeah. So basically, it's nice because the practices we always start with what is natural in a way. That is, we first usually receive compassion from others. You know, when you're a child,
Mm.
you start with being like exposed to the compassion from others, care from others. So first, you teach people how to generate images of compassionate others. Some of us, some clients, you never had somebody compassionate towards us. So it can happen that
Mm.
we had difficult childhood, and sometimes it's very important to teach the brain to generate a compassionate image. So sometimes we really help clients to say, okay, it's okay if you didn't have it. It is sad. It is sad, but at the same time, how would it be if you could imagine an ideal compassionate image? So you really help clients create their own ideal compassionate image with
Mm.
the features of courage, of wisdom, and this image needs to be there, willing to help you. And
Mm.
so the first step is to receive compassion from someone, even a imagery, even someone that doesn't really exist, but at least you start. And then the important part is when we ask our clients to try and say, okay, imagine that you now become gradually this identity, this person with the same qualities of the creature you just imagined. So maybe
Mm.
just breathe in and breathe out, and just like even a little bit playful. Like, why don't you imagine becoming wiser? And how would it be if you become like someone maybe older, wiser, with this
Mm.
compassionate intention? And so we actually use a lot of acting techniques to help
Mm.
people embody the part of themselves that is compassionate. And then at that point, a lot of OCD clients actually felt that it was pretty useful because I still remember one client. She was lovely, actually American client. She was struggling with OCD, and one day I asked her like, "Why don't you imagine being like a very dignified, compassionate creature walking in this room, and then when the intrusions come, imagine that like you kind of welcome them and you want to
Mm,
embrace them and maybe tell them like, I know where you come from, you're kind of welcome, I'll do my best to welcome you." And I was kind of asking her to stay with this dignified posture and to keep the posture in a compassionate posture. And at the end she was like laughing a little bit, and she was like, if I keep my compassionate posture with a little bit of a tiny smile on my face, it's very hard to be negatively triggered by these thoughts. It feels like they trigger me. They're still there, but they trigger me less.
mm,
And I was like, see, like sometimes when I mean, it's not always a miracle. That was pretty quick, but sometimes it takes a little bit of time. But we realize that we can actually meet our inner world, our inner intrusions, and our thoughts with a more compassionate space. And so we
mm,
don't necessarily have to make them stop, because sometimes it's impossible. But
yeah.
what we can enlarge is our compassionate awareness. So the mix is more, it's a nicer mix for the brain, because sometimes when you cannot remove something, and sometimes you cannot remove, but you can enlarge the space that contains it.
When you were talking, I was picturing who would be like who I received compassion from, and it was funny once I was able to get somebody in my head. It there was a warmth that sort of washed over
Yes.
me, and it felt really good. So are there any more exercises that you do? Because I feel like my audience listening, like this is so helpful. Like the picturing of somebody to then embody that, the exercise of picture. Then when you said picture yourself as older and wiser and more compassionate, what would that look like and feel like, and how would you move in the world? My brain was like, it was going. I was in it with you there, and I could
Yes.
picture it. Is there anything else that you do?
Yeah, something that we did with my clients, is that sometimes when you are in your compassionate self, because there are many identities in us, right? And one of them is an identity that probably you experienced that in your life. Probably the Zach that started this podcast, the start that the process, is a very wise, compassionate person that, as you
Mm,
are, that wants to also alleviate other people and help other people. So there is a part of us that actually has this wisdom, has this willingness to help others, and also ourselves, but also others. And so after you playfully find your compassionate self, and sometimes you can even create your own posture, you create your facial expression, how would it be? And maybe you can create a little bit of a tiny smile with your face, and you can ask yourself, how would it breathe? How would I breathe if in this very moment, if I were at my deepest of compassion, if I was acting like completely compassionately, how would I breathe? So at that point, for example, you can sit on a chair, and you can ask yourself, okay, now in this very moment, I am my compassionate self. And like, I, open up my shoulders, and I breathe in and I breathe out. And then maybe I want to have another chair in front of me. And in that chair, there is a part of me that is in pain, and for example can be
mm,
the part of me that feels guilty, or even I have some of my clients asking I ask some of my clients to picture their OCD there, because
mm,
some of the clients, of course, we become angry at our own disease.
mm.
I have a lot of clients with OCD that were very frustrated, and they hated the whole
Yes,
city. And in a
yes.
way that created, right? That created an inner sense of threat.
Mm,
And so sometimes I was like, okay, let's start imagining how would you see this OCD you there, and try to tell me how could you picture that part of you from these compassionate eyes. Can you see, for example, the suffering this part,
Mm.
is originated by, and trying to connect with compassion with that part. Or
Mm.
maybe, for example, with OCD, we know from a lot of research that OCD, people with OCD and people struggling with intrusions, we tend to suffer, we tend to avoid a specific type of guilt. So
Mm.
we know that, for example, um, some of us struggle with feeling a sense of guilt, and so sometimes
Yeah.
intrusions and compulsions are really have the goal of avoiding the sense of guilt. So sometimes I would ask, once I have identified the type of guilt the client struggles with, I would actually imagine them talking with their part of them that feels so guilty, and maybe
Mm.
like, what would your compassionate self tell this part, or can you write a compassion letter?
Yeah.
So dear guilty, dear
Yeah.
Niki, that feels so guilty. Here I am.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
want to tell you something. And yeah, a lot of ideas that, and also we create together with the clients. So sometimes it's very often it's very, very important to stay very collaborative and to
Mm.
really uh, accept the wisdom of the client, because everyone has a lot of wisdom also regarding the origin maybe of our own disease. So I think that the most important thing is to stay cooperative with the client. Say, what is wise for you? What would you like to? I remember one client, for example, and it was very funny because uh, she realized that she was struggling with OCD mostly during the weekends. And
Yeah.
so, because she was very busy with work, but when Friday would come, she was really, really
Mm.
hating the moment where she could feel all this. And so she said, I think I should create some special date with my OCD, like a dating. Oh, and I was like, what would you like to do with this OCD? Do you think you would like to have a dinner out with your OCD? So we created together this
Yeah.
exercise where she would say, I think my OCD would really want to go to a movie theater. I was like, so, and she came to me the week after and she said, that was actually a little bit helpful, because instead of fighting against this part of me, I would actually say, do you want to go out for a date with me? And creating a little bit of
Mm.
compassionate connection with this part of us. So just some ideas.
That's really cool. And she basically deliberately carved out time to be just
Yes.
her and her OCD and nothing
Yes.
distracting her or anything like that. I really like that because Niki, I'll tell you, I've noticed with myself that while I don't struggle as much with the intrusive thoughts anymore, I do find myself keeping myself busy and distracting myself. And I think that it has more to do with the discomfort that I feel from the anxiety and tension. Because the intrusive thoughts, I have gotten to a place where I feel that I can accept them. And it's even interesting what you brought up about putting your OCD on the chair across from you. That's something that we learn is you can make your OCD a separate character from you, somebody different. But what's interesting about what you said is the way that I've been taught and the way that I understand it is making the OCD separate and sort of talking sarcastically to the OCD and talking down to it. It I've never heard it described as talking to it compassionately and almost looking
Yeah.
at it with compassion and almost saying like, "Hey, I see you there, and I know that you're trying to keep me safe, and you think that the anxiety and these intrusive thoughts will get my attention, so that I then take an action and keep myself safe." I've never thought about talking to my OCD with compassion before, and I feel that that is really something that I want to try out. And I feel like this podcast is so interesting. Things come to me. It's weird, like life sort of things sort of flow to me when I'm in that when I'm ready to receive something. And more lately I've been like, I need to carve out time of silence where I meditate every day, so that is kind of that moment of silence, but another time throughout the day where I take my OCD on a date and it's just myself and my OCD and compassion. And I really appreciate that example because I think that is a really it's actionable. It's something that people can listen to this podcast and do. I know that you said you only have an hour, so we're at about 45 minutes now. How much more time do you have? I want to be respectful.
10 minutes.
10. Okay. So let's chat for 10 more minutes on this topic. And then I'm 100% going to have you back on because I want to talk about gender diversity as a clinician and as a client, but I don't think that we can give it the fair amount of time it needs right now. So let's stay on
Whenever
this
you.
topic. Yeah, and then I'll bring you on again for another episode. What about somebody like one thing that I've learned through doing this podcast actually, which is that's why I love this podcast so much. I learned so much about myself through it. I don't know if I'm good at showing myself love. And that's now something that I've been working on where every day I write a quality about myself that I like about myself. There when it comes to compassion, right? The word that comes to mind is like love, self-love. I feel like there's a lot of love and compassion.
Mm-hmm.
Do you run across clients that there's like this block or this resistance of showing themselves love and compassion?
Mm-hmm.
And if so, what are your suggestions on getting people more comfortable with self-love and self-compassion?
Well, that's a fantastic question. I actually, in my own process, because I also been in many, many psychotherapies myself.
Mm,
And I learned a lot through my own path. And so I think it's quite helpful to distinguish love from compassion, even
mm,
if they could seem related.
yeah.
But for example, when I'm thinking about feeling compassion for my self-criticism, I mean, I know my self-criticism. I think at this point I feel some kind of tenderness and some kind of like, okay, I know where you come from.
Mm,
But I don't think I love my self-criticism. What
mm,
what does it mean? Because sometimes, in order to feel the desire to help someone, um, in order to understand the pain that part comes from, you don't really need to love them. Love, from an evolutionary perspective, it really belongs to a slightly different area.
mm,
Paul would say there's nothing wrong about love. I mean, it's beautiful. At the same time, when you hear, for example, people experiencing compassion, for example, monks being tortured, or the what is actually very intriguing when you hear them is that they would talk a lot about compassion for the people that would torture them, but not necessarily love. Because when you feel because you can actually feel compassion without liking the other person. I mean, I don't like my self-criticism,
mm,
don't,
mm,
but I think I can feel compassion for that part of me. And I think it's
mm,
important because some clients, they feel like, so are you asking me to like my self-criticism? No, it's not about liking your self-criticism. It's more about understanding the pain it comes from. So you will probably never like it. I don't think I like my self-criticism, but at this point I can feel that, like, honey, you're hurting me, and I think we need to find an agreement here.
mm,
And so compassion is a slightly different from love, and I think it's quite helpful for us to say, I don't need to love the parts of me that are in pain, but I can still feel compassion for them. I can still feel a sense of wanting to help. Because the love is very much linked to the idea of liking. And sometimes
mm,
I don't think we will never like our symptoms. We will never like, but we could feel compassion for them. And the second thing about the blocks, I mean, in compassion focused therapy, we really believe that it's mostly about blocks and fears of compassion, right? Because if compassion were easy, like we would just download some YouTube videos and say, here we are,
yes.
I finally know how to train my biceps. And it doesn't really work like that, because
Yeah.
as soon as you start doing something that looks like simple, you start feeling a lot of many types of emotions, disgust, or you feel tired, you want to sleep, or you feel anger. And those are also emotions that protected us. So
Mm.
in compassion focused therapy, feeling blocks to compassion is not really a mistake. It's actually something that it's part of the game. Actually, we start with that. And so we also try to see those fears and, and blocks as parts that are scared themselves. And so maybe starting giving compassion to them, etc.
You said something really interesting, which is that maybe these emotions. I think we got like 5 minutes, so I want to get this question in. You've just been so great. You said something about how sometimes when we're starting to feel more compassion for ourselves, anger might come up, or we might feel really tired and that we want to go to sleep. I really resonated with that second example. It every now and again when my anxiety drops and I don't feel any anxiety, it's like immediately I could just sleep. Like I just become so tired and I could just sleep. Is there an aspect of all of this where do our brains get addicted to a certain emotion, and because it's what we thought, our brains thought that that's what was keeping us safe, and we kind of become addicted to that or conditioned to that? And what are your thoughts on that? Because that was an interesting point that you mentioned.
Yeah, because I mean, when there can be a sense of sleepiness and being tired that actually comes as a resistance to the practice. So when you
Mm,
start meditating, you all of a sudden feel like, oh, I'm sleeping. And that's probably could be a resistance. Could be that you're tired and you need to
yeah.
sleep, but sometimes it is a resistance. Another thing you're mentioning is slightly different. It's very, very interesting because sometimes when you remove anxiety, so when you remove the source of your anxiety and your anxiety, you enter in a state of safety. Safety means you're
Mm,
just removing the triggers of anxiety from your life. However, in compassion focused therapy, we really distinguish safety, that is removal of anxiety, from what we call safeness. Safeness is not just when you remove anxiety, because when you remove something, you could easily be bored, maybe,
mm,
or you
mm,
can go fall asleep. But when we talk about safeness, is when actually you increase something in your life. That for us is a sense of deep contentment, and that sometimes comes with connection and compassion. So a lot of clients, a lot of us, really, all of us, we think that in order to stay safe, we just have to remove things that don't work out very well in our life. So I need to remove the triggers to my anxiety. Sometimes, however, we also have to increase something, that is the spaciousness, the sense of feeling connected and the contentment. That
mm,
actually is where you need to work on. Most of the clients need to work exactly on increasing the second type of safeness, because otherwise you feel more and more like trapped in places. In order for you to avoid triggers, you first are, blocked in your house and then in your room. So you want to avoid more and more. So in a way, not only you need to avoid anxiety, and sometimes when you cannot avoid triggers of anxiety, what you have to deal to increase is your sense of like how able I am to deal with them, or how much safeness am I experiencing. There's a beautiful way of saying, like, when you cannot stop the waves, it's better
dive
you
in.
know how to surf.
Ah, yes,
And
yes.
so, in a way, a flat sea, a sea without triggers, without anxiety is like nice, but maybe it could be boring and I could fall asleep. Maybe it's also nice to have waves, hopefully not too high, and also to know to have enough stability to surf them and to be able to navigate them.
Mm. I think that that was an excellent analogy to end on, so you can be on time for your next call. But Niki, this was a really great introduction into compassion focused therapy. I think you did an excellent job of explaining. I have a million more questions, so we're definitely gonna have to bring you on again to the show to expand on compassion focused therapy, talk about gender diversity as a clinician and a client, and just continue to spread your wisdom and compassion in the mental health space. Because I really enjoyed this conversation. I can't thank you enough for coming on.
Thank you, Zach. Thank you also for what you're doing is really very helpful. And I really believe that mental health should be promoted by people like you and people like us, that we go through our own things, right? Instead from like some guru or some
Exactly.
professor. So what you're doing is really helpful. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you for coming on the show.
Thank you. So I'll see you soon.
See you soon.
Bye.